Well, last week we finished chapter 27, so now we're ready to move on to chapter 28. But before we do, let me make one last comment about the last verse in chapter 27. If you would look at verse number 46 in chapter 27, notice what it says. Then Rebekah said to Isaac, I am sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them. Now, women here, you can start using this as a figure of speech. If you have some woman at the office that you don't like, just start calling them a Hittite. But anyways, here Rebekah is, and she's saying, I can't stand. I am sick and tired of these Hittite women. Now, last week, I asked you a question. I asked you, why did you think that this verse was inserted in this particular spot? Because it really doesn't fit. Think about it. Esau has just threatened to kill Jacob just as soon as Isaac dies. So what does Mama do? Mama says, Jacob, you need to leave town and you need to leave quick. And I want you to understand that you don't need to come back until Esau cools off. Because what she was thinking is, if Jacob would leave for a while, he would be out of sight, out of mind, and eventually Esau would forget about him because really he was easily distracted and he didn't stay focused for very long. So what she wanted him to do was she wanted him to leave, and then when Esau forgot about it and got over it, she could call for him and he could come home again. And that's what we're reading about when all of a sudden things change in midstream. Out of nowhere, Rebekah turns to Isaac and she says, I am sick and tired of these local Hittite women. I would rather die than see Jacob marry one of them. Now, what in the world does that have to do with the story that we're reading about? Well, there's two reasons why this verse is inserted in this particular spot. First of all, the author of Genesis wants us to know just how rebellious Esau really was. You see, in their culture, marriages were arranged by the father. And the father wouldn't even consider arranging a marriage if he didn't think that his son was mature enough to get married. And it was also tradition for the older son to get married first. Now, Esau wasn't mature enough to get married, but Jacob was. But since it was tradition for the older son to get married before the younger son, Isaac hadn't made arrangements for either one of them. Isaac was waiting for Esau to grow up. But Esau refused to grow up, and he also refused to wait. So he took matters into his own hands, and he went out, and he didn't just marry one Canaanite woman, he married two. Look back at Genesis chapter 26, verses 34 through 35. It says, at the age of 40, okay, Esau is tired of waiting. He doesn't care what the old man says. He's going to go get married. So at the age of 40, Esau married two Hittite wives, Judith, the daughter of Beri, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon. But Esau's wives made life miserable for Isaac and Rebekah. So that was the first reason that verse number 46 is thrown in here. So we could see just how rebellious Esau was, because he did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. He didn't care about customs. He didn't care about traditions. He didn't care about obedience to his parents. He was going to do what he wanted, when he wanted to do it. Now, the second reason that verse number 46 is thrown in here is to give us more insight into Isaac. You see, Isaac had heard about Esau's threats. It wasn't just Rebekah that overheard this. Oh, no. Esau was the kind of guy that if he was in a bad mood, you knew about it, everyone knew about it. So when he decided that he was going to kill Jacob just as soon as Dad dies, he started telling people about it, and I'm sure that Isaac heard it too. The only difference was Isaac didn't take it seriously. In his mind, Esau's just talking. He wouldn't really do it. He loves his brother, and he would never do anything to hurt him. But Rebekah knew better. But she also knew that Isaac wouldn't listen to her. So she had to give Isaac another reason for Jacob leaving and for going so far away. And the perfect excuse was to find a mate. So that's the second reason that verse number 46 was thrown in here. It was to convince Isaac that Jacob needed to leave and he needed to go to Haran. Now, the correct pronunciation is Haran, but we don't say it that way in Oklahoma, so I'm going to stick with Haran. If that bothers you, and I doubt it will because most of you grew up hearing it Haran, right? We're just going to keep on doing that. So now that you know that, we're ready to study chapter 28. So turn to Genesis chapter 28, and let's read verses 1 through 5. So Isaac called for Jacob, blessed him, and said, "You must not marry any of these Canaanite women. Instead, go at once to Paddan-Aram, to the house of your grandfather Bethuel, and marry one of your uncle Laban's daughters. May God Almighty bless you and give you many children, and may your descendants multiply and become many nations. May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessings he promised to Abraham. May you own this land where you are now living as a foreigner, for God gave this land to Abraham." So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Paddan-Aram to stay with his uncle Laban, his mother's brother, the son of Bethuel, the Aramean. Now, in preparation for Jacob's journey, Isaac does what he should have done in the very first place. He has the blessing ceremony, and he's designating Jacob to be the rightful heir of the birthright. Now, people, this is a public ceremony, and that's why Esau is there, and he heard everything that Isaac said to Jacob. Look at verse number 6. It says, "Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan-Aram to take to himself a wife from there, and that when he blessed him, he charged him, saying," in other words, he not only saw him bless him, but he heard everything that he said. He blessed him, he charged him, saying, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan." Now, I want you to underline that word saw. Saw is translated from the Hebrew word ra'ah, and it means that Esau physically saw him with his own two eyes. He saw Isaac blessing Jacob, and he heard with his own two ears everything that Isaac said to Jacob. He heard the blessing as well as the command not to take a wife from the daughters of the Canaanites, which means that this was a public ceremony. This was the way the blessing was supposed to be given, in a public ceremony with all of the members present, and many times all of your higher ranking servants. So you would have this public ceremony, and for witnesses, you brought in others who weren't family. You would bring in those who were servants, but they were in management positions. And you would have the lower servants come in, and they would begin to feed at this banqueting table. But Esau is present. So we know this was a public ceremony. Now, let's look at the blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob. Look at verses 3 and 4. "May God Almighty bless you and give you many children, and may your descendants multiply and become many nations. May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessings he promised to Abraham. May you own this land where you are now living as a foreigner, for God gave this land to Abraham." Now, do you see anything missing in this blessing? Remember, there's two parts to the blessing, right? Yeah. So the first part, which explained why Jacob was chosen, has been left out. Remember, the blessing had two parts. The first part was an explanation of why this particular son was chosen to receive the birthright, why he was worthy to receive it. And the second part was a special prayer invoking God's blessings upon the recipient. But Isaac skipped the first part and went right to the second part, and this is the second time that he's done that. Now, you see, you and I, we don't really notice these things. But if you were a Jew, especially around Jesus' time or any time in the Old Testament, you would have recognized, well, Isaac didn't do it right the second time. He left out one of the important parts of the blessing, the first part, which explains why this son is worthy to receive the blessing. But Isaac skipped it, and he went right to the second part. So why did he do that? Well, it's kind of interesting, because let's be honest. He could have given a dozen reasons why Jacob was worthy to receive it. So it wasn't like, well, I got two sons and they're both worthless and I'm going to pick the worst of, or the best of the worst. You see what I'm saying? Or the best of the, how would you say it? Of the two. But he didn't do that. And what's interesting is when you look in Jacob's life, as we looked at what the Bible has to say about him, he was a righteous person. He was upright. He was a very obedient child. The only time that we ever see him as a child, underneath Isaac and Rebekah, his parents, seem to do something that was wrong, it's when his mother said, listen to me, you do what I say. And he says, Mom, this isn't right. What if he finds out and he's going to curse me? She says, you let me handle that. Put it upon me. So basically, he's obeying what Mom told him to do. So there were a dozen reasons that he could give as to why Jacob was worthy to receive the birthright. But he doesn't do it. So why does he skip, or why did he skip the first part? Well, he skipped the first part because it was a public ceremony and Esau was present. Esau was there. And Isaac did what most fathers of problem children do. He refused to voice the shortcomings of his problem child Esau, and he also refused to publicly praise or acknowledge the accomplishments of the good child in the home, which was Jacob. You see, Isaac should have explained why Esau was being disqualified as the recipient of the birthright, because he was the firstborn. And as the firstborn, he had a right to know why he was being disqualified. And everyone else also had a right to know because they were family. They were part of this family. So they had a right to know why Esau was being rejected and Jacob was being selected. Look at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21. I want to read verses 16 and 17 again. And the reason I say again is because we read this last week. But notice what it says. When the man divides his inheritance, he may not give the larger inheritance to his younger son, the son of the wife he loves, as if he were the firstborn son. He must recognize the rights of his oldest son, the son of the wife he does not love, by giving him a double portion. He is the first son of his father's virility, and the rights of the firstborn belong to him. Now, yes, the law was given after the story. So this story was before this law. But you need to understand that the culture and the tradition of that time were consistent with this law. This was the way it was done. It wasn't that Moses came up with something new. Oh, God's revealed this. No. This was the common law at the time. This was the tradition and the custom of the time. If the older son was to be disqualified, he wasn't going to receive the birthright, an explanation had to be made. And the reason an explanation had to be made is because the law stated that you couldn't just say, well, you know, because this is a polygamous society, I don't really love the mother as much as I love this mother. Therefore, I'm going to, in order to please her, give her son, who's not the oldest, the birthright. He couldn't do that. The law didn't allow that. The only way that you could come in and not give the firstborn the birthright is if he proved to be unworthy. So you had to give an explanation, and you had to give it publicly. But again, Isaac was the typical father of a problem child. He didn't voice or publicly acknowledge the shortcomings of Esau, but neither did he praise or publicly acknowledge the good qualities and the accomplishments of Jacob. In Isaac's mind, well, that would make Esau feel bad. And God knows we don't want to do that. So let's pretend that we don't notice the behavior of our problem child. Let's not talk about it. Let's not acknowledge it. We'll all pretend that all of these things that he does and has done has never happened and will never happen again. Yeah. And he was thinking, let's not acknowledge the good behavior or accomplishments of the other children. That would make Esau feel like he can't ever measure up. Now, some of you have problem children, and you can relate to Isaac. You do the very same things. Because that's the typical behavior of parents, and especially fathers who have a problem child. That's why when I was teaching this series on problem children, I told you that Esau was the poster child of problem children. And I really didn't go into it. I gave a few examples of why I said that. But when you study the story, you can't help but see Esau was the poster child of problem children. But I'm going to go further. Isaac was the poster parent of a problem child. All the typical behavior of parents, what they do when they have a problem child, Isaac did. Now here's what's interesting. It's human behavior to do these things. But hopefully, as you read the Word of God, you will recognize that and change it. But the sad truth is, most don't. Most parents who have a problem child, without even realizing it, they do these things. They will never publicly acknowledge, they will never voice any of these things that the problem child does, not out in public. And they try to hide it from the other kids, but all the other kids know their brother or their sister is a problem child. But not only that, because they don't want this problem child to feel bad about themselves, before they realize it, they get to the point where they never acknowledge the accomplishments or the good things or the attributes or the characteristics of the other children in the home, because, well, that will make the problem child feel like they can't measure up. That will add to the low self-esteem. People, let me just tell you something about problem children. Many times they're very, very intelligent, and they manipulate the whole situation. And this was Esau. And we're going to see that as we go through. But I want you to notice what God is doing is he's painting a picture of a very dysfunctional family. And the reason this is a very dysfunctional family is because Esau is a problem child, and Isaac is the typical father of a problem child. He takes the family and makes it even more dysfunctional. He ends up splitting the family because of the way he did things. Now, let's look at the blessing again. May God Almighty bless you and give you many children, and may your descendants multiply and become many nations. May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessings he promised to Abraham. Now, did you catch that? May God pass on to you and your descendants the blessings he promised to Abraham. May you own this land where you are now, living as a foreigner, for God gave this land to Abraham. Now, here's what's interesting. This blessing was the very same blessing that was passed down from Abraham to Isaac. In fact, this blessing is linked to the promises that God gave to Abraham in chapters 12 and 17. So it began with God specifically making promises to Abraham. Those promises were then passed to Isaac through the blessing, which means that God's promises to Abraham would be fulfilled through Isaac's descendants, not Ishmael's. And now they're being passed down to Jacob through the blessing, which means that God's promises to Abraham were going to be fulfilled through Jacob's descendants, not Esau's. It's going to be Jacob's descendants, the Jews, through which the seed of the woman is going to come, Jesus. So as I told you when we began this study in Genesis, Genesis is the foundation for the entire Bible. It's the foundation for the entire Old Testament. Do we want to know why God all of a sudden focuses in on the Jews? Because at the very end of this book, we're going to see the children of Israel, I should say this, the children of Jacob. God does change his name to Israel, but I want you to understand, I'm talking about Jacob's 12 children or sons. They're going to go into Egypt, and they're going to multiply, and God's going to bless them like he said. And in the book of Exodus, which is the second book, Genesis, Exodus, he's going to send Moses there, and he's going to lead the children of Israel out of bondage. And of course, they're going to wander around in the wilderness because they didn't have faith. But eventually, they're going to come into the promised land. And from that time on, the whole Old Testament focuses in on Israel, the descendants of Jacob. But we wouldn't know why if we didn't study the book of Genesis. And the whole reason it's so important that we stick with the Jews is because of the promise that's made to Abraham, but it actually goes further back. It goes back to the promise that God made to Adam and Eve after they fell. The seed of the woman would bring salvation. And who is the seed of the woman? Jesus. So we now have this promise of the seed of the woman. Then Abraham comes along, and we have the seed of the woman, the promise made to him. It's going to come through his descendants. And now he has two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. But now we're going to come in and say it's going to come through Isaac. And then as Isaac has two children, Esau and Jacob, now we find out that the promises made to Abraham especially the seed of the woman, is going to come through Jacob. So by the time we get to the end of the book of Genesis, we know why the Old Testament is focused on the Jews. Does that make sense? Now, if there's any doubt that Jacob was the one receiving the birthright, that's dispelled in verse number 5. Look at verse number 5. Then Isaac sent Jacob on his way, and he went to Paddan-Aram. So Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, who was the mother of Jacob and Esau. Now again, because of our heritage, because we're Gentiles and not Jews, we don't notice anything strange there. But did anyone notice anything strange at the very end of verse number 5? Yeah, the names are reversed. Notice the order of the names in the last part of this verse. Rebekah, who was the mother of Jacob and Esau. You see, the order of their names demonstrates preeminence of status that Jacob now has over Esau. Jacob is now being recognized as the firstborn, even though he was the younger. He has the birthright, so he's listed as the firstborn. And from this time on, Jacob will always be mentioned first. Look at Joshua chapter 24, verse number 4. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. To Esau I gave the mountain of Seir, while Jacob and his children went down into Egypt. Now notice that Jacob is mentioned first, as if he's the firstborn. Because he is the firstborn, because he got the birthright. It didn't matter who was born first. If the firstborn was disqualified from receiving the birthright, he was not listed first. He's not to be the patriarch. Now, why in the world is this stated in verse number 5? I'm going to look at another example in a second. I'll tell you why. The reason it's stated like this in verse number 5, and it begins here, is to make sure that you understand that Isaac blessed of his own accord, not just because he was tricked. Once he realized his eyes were open, I was getting ready to be disobedient to God, I know better than to do that. When it was time for Jacob to leave, he goes ahead and has the public ceremony, and he comes out and he gives the blessing to Jacob. But the only problem is he didn't give the first part. So the Jews would be going, well, I see the blessing ceremony, and I see the blessing itself, but why didn't he give the first part? So in verse number 5, they make sure you understand by putting Jacob first that this is what he was doing, Isaac was doing. He was giving the blessing to Jacob. Now look at Hebrews 11:20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. There it is again. Jacob is mentioned first as if he's the firstborn, even though he wasn't the firstborn. Why? Because he received the birthright. It is through him, the promises that God made to Abraham, those promises are going to come upon his descendants and not Esau's. Now, let's look at Esau's reaction to all of this. He was mad before, right? Yes, he's mad. He's mad because Jacob has stolen my birthright. Now, wait a minute. You sold that birthright. You even made a vow. There was no fingers crossed, legs crossed. I didn't mean it. No. But see, he wasn't going to honor that. And so he got upset when Jacob comes in and he feels like he's stolen the blessing. And again, as I told you, according to the law, all Isaac would have had to have done was to say, wait a minute, you received that blessing through deception. I'm not going to honor it. In fact, I'm now going to curse you for what you've done. And that's what Jacob was so worried about. What if he finds out? What if he doesn't? How's this going to work out? Mommy's going to bring the cursing, and she says, you just leave it to me. And I'm sure, because this isn't written in here, but it probably happened like this, I'm sure Rebekah had a talk with Isaac. You knew better. And so now that Jacob's getting ready to go, he has this public ceremony, the blessing, and he publicly gives it to him. Now, Esau was mad before, but now that we have the public ceremony, Now that in front of everyone, Isaac does it formally and officially. He left out the first part because, again, he is the typical parent of a problem child. He doesn't want Esau to feel bad. Hey, Esau's not stupid. He knows he's not getting the blessing. But he doesn't do the first part. He goes right into the second part, and everyone knows he is now the one who's received the birthright. He's going to get a double portion of the inheritance, but not only that, he will be the patriarch of the family, but even more importantly, the blessings that God gave to Abraham will come through his descendants and not Esau's. And so let's see Esau's reaction to this. Look at and let's read verses 6 through 9. When Esau saw, okay, I've seen it with my own two eyes, that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan-Aram to take him a wife from thence, and that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. And that Jacob obeyed his father and his mother and was gone to Paddan-Aram. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. And he saw that Jacob obeyed. This is what always ticked Esau off about Jacob. Goody two-shoes. Always doing what mom and dad says. Always obedient, always doing what God wanted him to do, always doing what mom and dad did. Stick up for yourself. That's what Esau's thinking. But Esau's a typical problem child. So once he sees that this is official, okay, we've had it. It's here. He's given it to him. He saw that he didn't want him to marry a Canaanite woman. And now Jacob's obedient. He's taken off. Verse 8. And Esau, seeing that the daughters of Canaan pleased not Isaac his father, he realizes that. He knew it before. He understood that. Mom and dad were trying to make it work because they love Esau. He's a problem child, but he's still their child. He's still their flesh and blood. He's been disobedient. He didn't wait for the dad, for his father to make arrangements for the wedding. No, he did things on his timetable. He went out, got who he wanted to marry. They came in and they made Isaac and Rebekah's life miserable. But mom and dad are trying to make it work. And because they tried to make it work, Esau, like most problem child, is kind of blind to all the problems that his wives are causing. But now he sees that the daughters of Canaan pleased not Isaac his father. Then went Esau unto Ishmael, and took unto the wives which he had Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife. Now I want you to notice that when Esau heard Isaac telling Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman because he didn't approve of them, he went straight to his uncle Ishmael, and he married one of his daughters. Now, why did he do that? Anyone know? There are two theories. There are two theories as to why he did this. The first theory is that he was trying to get his father's approval and get back into his parents' good grace. You see, they wanted Jacob to marry a daughter from Rebekah's brother Laban. Look back at verse number 2. They told Jacob, Arise, go to Paddan-Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and from there take yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. So Esau reasoned that if they wanted Jacob to marry a daughter from Rebekah's brother, Laban, then he should marry a daughter from Isaac's brother, Ishmael. Because that's the very same thing, except it's from dad's side of the family instead of mom's side. So that should please them, right? Well, that's why some scholars believe that. Some scholars believe that Esau was trying to gain his father's approval and get back into the good graces of his parents. But I don't believe that. I don't believe that for one moment. In fact, I believe he did it just to spite his parents. This is tit for tat. You don't like what I did? You disqualified me from the birthright? You've given it to Jacob? Now you want him to pick this wife? Now that I see what really ticks you off, guess what? I'm going to spite you. Now, why do I believe this? Well, if you remember, Sarah told Abraham that she didn't want Isaac to have to share any of the inheritance with Ishmael. Do you remember that? So his mother was given her freedom and Ishmael was disinherited. If you remember the law of the land, she was a concubine. And so when Sarah came along and realized she wasn't getting pregnant, she'd passed the time when she could get pregnant. She'd entered into menopause, and so she could no longer get pregnant. So what did she do? She took her handmaiden Hagar, and she said, Abraham, you sleep with her, and we'll have a child through her. So she became a concubine. She is a servant in which Abraham's having sex with her, and she gets pregnant. Now, when she gets pregnant, she begins to despise Sarah. Do you remember the story? And the reason she despised her is because I'm young and beautiful. Sarah's older. Now, she still had to be a very beautiful woman as you look at the other stories, but at the same time, she's older. She can no longer produce any children. And so I'm this young thing. I'm probably 17, 18 years old, Hagar's thinking. I've given you this son. And as a result of that, she gets to thinking, because Abraham treats her well. Abraham's just that type of person. He loves her. He loves Sarah. He loves the son Ishmael. So she gets to thinking that she doesn't have to obey Sarah, who was her servant. Was her master. Remember, she was Sarah's handmaiden because she thinks Abraham is going to exalt her to the status of an official wife. And Sarah says, you get in there and take care of it. And Abraham knows which side of his bread that it's buttered on, so he tells her, you do what you want to do. And she goes in there and beats the dog out of her. How many of you remember the story? So Hagar runs off, God comes to her, and she goes back, and she submits. But she now understands her place. She is not going to be elevated to the status of a full wife or to an official wife. She is a concubine. Now, according to the law, Ishmael, even though he was the son of a concubine, still got a share of the inheritance. So when Isaac comes along, guess what? Isaac's going to have to share the inheritance. Now, here's the interesting thing. Ishmael does not get the right of the firstborn because he's from a concubine, and the law states that you don't do that. This has nothing to do with wives. Remember Deuteronomy when it says you had 2 wives? She was not a wife, she was a concubine. Remember that? So here's what's interesting. Sarah looks over there and she sees one day that Ishmael is bullying and teasing Isaac. Now, if you remember, Ishmael is 14 to 15 years older than Isaac, and this is the time for him to be weaned, which means he was at least 3 years old, maybe possibly all the way up to 5 years old. That means that Ishmael was anywhere between the ages of 17 to 21. Anywhere in there. And he's picking on her. And all of a sudden, Sarah has it. She doesn't want Isaac to have to share anything with her handmaiden son. So she tells Abraham, you get rid of her. Now remember the law. If he will free her, then he doesn't have to give an inheritance to her son because she received her freedom in its place. See, most of us don't remember that. And boy, Abraham doesn't want to do it. He loves Ishmael. So God has a talk and says, this is part of my plan, you do it. I'll take care of him. And of course, God honors that, and we show that. But here's what I want you to understand something. Even though there was an open hostility between Ishmael and Isaac, they still didn't have a great relationship. Because in Ishmael's eyes, Isaac, Daddy got rid of me. Yeah, he set my mama free. But we left. And you got it all. And Isaac remembers, because I'm sure Sarah told him, the problems that was created because of that and what took place. And so even though there wasn't open hostility between Ishmael and Isaac, they still didn't have a great relationship. Because Abraham could have married Hagar and elevated her from a concubine to an official wife, but he didn't do it. So even though those two were civil to each other, they still didn't get along. They didn't have a good relationship. So, this is my point. If Esau thought that he could get into Isaac and Rebekah's good graces by marrying one of Ishmael's daughters, he was stupid beyond belief. Does everyone understand that? And I don't think he was stupid at all. Esau was not a stupid person. Most problem children are very, very intelligent. They just think differently. So he wasn't stupid, he was just a problem child. And a problem child will just about always do the opposite of what their parents want. If you have a problem child, you know what I'm talking about. If you want your child to buy these pants, they're not buying those pants, they're buying those pants. If you want your child not to go to the party, they want to go to the party. If you want them to go to the party, they don't want to go to the party. Usually with the problem child, they want just the opposite of what you want. So Esau probably realized that his parents didn't want him marrying Canaanite women, and they would really hate it if he married one of Ishmael's daughters. So guess what the first thing he does? Right after the public ceremony, giving him the blessing and finding out he didn't want Jacob to marry a Canaanite woman. You don't want a Canaanite woman? Watch what I do, Mom and Dad. I'm going to bring home one of Ishmael's daughters. And he does it. That's exactly what he did. Which just gives you more insight into the type of person that Esau was. But people, that is typical behavior of a problem child. Whatever you don't want them to do is exactly what they're going to do. And the reason this is put in here is because God wants us to know that he's not being unfair and unjust. You don't want the promises of God going through Esau's descendants. That's not the way biblical principles work. And so in the midst of this dysfunctional family, we take a step back and go, my gosh, how in the world did you get someone as healthy as Jacob through this? And you've all been taught that, Jacob was just this horrible person until God got a hold of him, which is not true. We just didn't understand it through Jewish eyes. We saw it through Gentile eyes. So as you can see, Esau was a problem child from day one, and he grew into a problem adult, and there's no way that he should have received the blessing. And that's what God wants us to know, so that by the time we now begin to focus on Jacob, because he's going to Paddan-Aram, which is just an area in which Haran is a part of, we realize why the focus is on him. He's the guy, and his descendants are the ones through which the seed of the woman is going to come through. Now, let's look at Jacob's journey. Look at verse 10. Meanwhile, Jacob left Beersheba and traveled towards Haran. Now, let me show you how far it is from Beersheba to Haran, and a little bit about the country of Israel. Let me begin by familiarizing you with this map. Of course, this is the Mediterranean Sea. North of it is modern-day Turkey. South is Egypt. In between Egypt and Israel is the Sinai Peninsula. Here you have the Red Sea. It splits into two gulfs. The Red Sea continues on to the Suez Canal, takes you out to the Mediterranean Sea. Then you have the Gulf of Aqaba. Actually looks like rabbit ears, if you notice that. The Gulf of Aqaba takes you to the port of Aqaba, and Jordan owns all of this. This is the nation of Jordan on the west side of Israel. Now in Israel, you can see the Sea of Galilee. If you notice where my cursor is, it's the little hand that's there. From the Sea of Galilee, you have the Jordan River that flows down to the Dead Sea. Directly west of the Dead Sea, you have Beersheba. From Beersheba to Jerusalem, it's about 45 miles. Let me zoom in so you can see the distance between a few of these places. Here's Jerusalem. Beersheba is about 45 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's about 35 miles directly west of the Dead Sea. Now Haran is in modern-day Syria. You can see it up north here. The distance, let me zoom out just a little bit. The distance from Haran to Beersheba is about 460 miles as the crow flies. But of course, that's not the way Jacob would have traveled. You wouldn't be able to go through the desert, so you would have to stay on the existing roads. And if you notice this purple line, that is the existing roads that they all would have traveled. So Jacob would have come from Beersheba past Jerusalem, past Shechem, and then he would have crossed over the Jordan River, followed the existing roads all the way to Haran, which was a distance of about 550 to 600 miles on foot. Now the reason I was showing you that is because sometimes we think Oh boy, 2 or 3 days he got there. No. It took him 3 days just to get to the point where he's going to have this tremendous revelation from God. He has the dream of the staircase. It's referred to as Jacob's ladder. How many of you remember Jacob's ladder? That's a very important story. In fact, Jesus will actually compare himself to Jacob's ladder. So we wanted to spend a lot of time on Jacob's ladder and what it means and how it was such an important turning point in Jacob's life. At this point, God's going to confirm that, yes, you were the one I chose to receive the birthright. And the promises of Abraham are going to go through you.